Hello, I'm Jenny Prisk, President and founder of Voices of Women. We are a group of women in San Diego who came together after September 11 to explore how we as global citizens could become leaders in a worldwide campaign for peace. Tonight we bring you the second in a series of programs on global community and human security. Our featured speaker is James Goldsborough, the award-winning foreign affairs columnist for the San Diego Union Tribune. His remarks will be followed by a lively and thought-provoking question and answer session with the audience. Please stay with us.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the University of San Diego and the Joan Kroc Institute for Peace and Justice. My name is Joyce New, and I'm the Executive Director of the Institute for Peace and Justice, and I apologize for our starting late this evening. That's the bad news. The good news is that we have such a wonderfully full house this evening. So I want to thank you for your patience as we all got settled and brought in some extra chairs so that we could accommodate a few extra people. So thank you, and we are all looking forward to a great evening this evening. It's a very appropriate evening to discuss elections and citizen involvement, in fact, because today is the International Day of Peace. Declared by the United Nations September 7th, 2001. And in fact, as part of the UN resolution that was passed in 2001, it says, it declares that the International Day of Peace shall henceforth be observed as a day of global ceasefire and nonviolence, an invitation to all nations and people to honor a cessation of hostilities for the duration of the day. And it invites all member states, organizations of the UN system, regional and non-governmental organizations and individuals to commemorate in an appropriate manner the International Day of Peace, including through education and public awareness. And so I want to thank Voices of Women for bringing this event to the Institute, for bringing James Goldsborough back to the Institute. In fact, he was just here yesterday for the Hans Morgenthau seminar that was held here. We're delighted that he's back again today. And again, we are very grateful to Voices of Women for working with us to help bring public awareness to some of the issues of great concern to all of us. And with that, I would like to turn the podium over to Jenny Prisk, the President of Voices of Women. Thank you.
Well, my goodness, welcome everybody, and thank you for filling the house. I have a sense that you believe that there is a stake in these upcoming elections and that you are here to learn more about it, and we are delighted that James Goldsborough is with us this evening. Thank you very much, Joyce, for having us here this evening in your beautiful institute. This is not our first partnering, and we always hope it will not be our last. The IPJ has opened its doors to us very generously to participate in a number of educational and mission-oriented events, and we're very delighted about that. So before I hand over, though, to James Goldsborough, it is my very, very great pleasure to introduce a very special guest in our audience tonight. Many of you will have met her. If you haven't, you will get to know her when she becomes the congressional representative in the 50th District when she defeats Randy Cunningham. Please welcome Francine Busby. Francine will be with us right throughout the presentation, of course, as are you all. The doors are locked, you cannot get out. And she will be available for questions, as will James Goldsborough. So now it's my great pleasure to move on to introducing our featured speaker for this evening. James Goldsborough, who I know many of you know already, joined the Union Tribune, the San Diego Union Tribune, in 1992 as a foreign affairs columnist. and he's also a member of the Union Tribune editorial board, which focuses on international issues. For 7 years prior to joining the UT, Mr. Goldsborough was an associate editor at the San Jose Mercury News, and before that, he spent 15 years in Europe as a foreign correspondent, where he wrote for the New York Herald Tribune, for the International Herald Tribune, and also for Newsweek. He's a former Edward R. Murrow Scholar at the Council for Foreign Relations. He's also a senior associate at the Carnegie Endowment. In addition, he is the author of a book entitled Rebel Europe, Living with a Changing Continent. However, I sense that most of you know him through reading his column, which is syndicated nationally by Copley News Service, and I am delighted and very pleased to welcome to the podium James Goldsborough.
Well, that was the nicest introduction I've ever had. Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. I can't think of two more worthy institutions coming together than the Kroc Institute and Voices for Women. I was here yesterday for a slightly more intimate gathering of Hans Morgen's Thaw scholars, but it's lovely to see a really big crowd like this. I have to tell you, if you haven't read my columns and you're expecting on the one hand this and on the other hand that, you're not going to get it. I just have one hand, and I don't hide that. So if in your questions you want to briefly mention the other hand, that's fine. This is the fourth time I have been here since George W. Bush conceived his war. And the first time it was before the war started, when I came up to say what a rotten idea I thought it was. The second idea was when he announced mission accomplished. The third time was yesterday when we discussed the war in theoretical terms as to whether it was in the national interest or not, and the fourth time is tonight. If any of you have been here for all four of these occasions, which would represent a very high degree of masochism, you will know that my view has been the same from the beginning, that this war is not in the American interest, that it will incite terrorism in the world, and indeed has already started to do so, that it's a violation of our principles, our history, and our honor. It makes a travesty of just war theory, which in these halls is very revered and should be revered by all of us. And it's a gross strategic mistake. There was an incident that took place March 21st, 1804. Napoleon ordered the Duc d'Enghien, who might have restored the monarchy, to be murdered, which he was. Talleyrand, who always had a phrase for everything, said, "C'est pire qu'un crime, c'est une faute." It's worse than a crime, it is a mistake. A crime you might well excuse a leader for. Raison d'état, reasons of state. Sometimes states, great states, do bad things in their own interest. You might make a case that the atomic bombs being dropped on Japan were such a case. That's how governments operate. We have to be realistic. We have to understand that this is the real world. As Hans Morgenthau, our most brilliant of foreign policy thinkers, would put it, nations have one primary national interest in their relations with other nations. It is the security of their territory and their institutions. You have to do what's necessary to protect the national security. But a mistake, how can you condone, how can you forgive a mistake? How can you forgive a political leader for acting incompetently, acting against national interest, for weakening national security? How can you forgive that? It's not to be forgiven. There's no raison d'etat for making a mistake. Morgenthau dedicated his career, starting with the Vietnam War, to show that these are not relative issues. It's not just that one of us thinks Iraq is a great idea and somebody else thinks it's not such a good idea. It's not that one side said Vietnam is wonderful and the other side said it's wrong. Morgenthau's principle is these things can be demonstrated. I mean, it's not scientific theory like physics, but there are objective measurements to determine what is in the national interest. He put it in terms of rational theories and objective laws to help determine the national interest. The failures of Vietnam, he said, were caused by false assumptions and dubious principles. Bush's war is based on the same false assumptions and dubious principles, I believe, as Johnson's and Nixon's war was. The false assumption is that you can make people accept you by killing them. And the dubious principle is that war and occupation of a distant nation that poses no threat to American security serves somehow the national interest. This election is the most important of our lifetime. That's how I was going to start this, but then I read that every election says that. They said that during the Harrison and Cleveland election. They said that during Coolidge and Davis. They said that during Ford and Carter. I think most historians would agree that those elections probably weren't too seminal in our history. Ford and Carter, both were moderates. Carter was a species known as the centrist Democrat, still well known in our country today. It walks many states. Ford represents a creature unfortunately gone extinct since 1976, the one known as Republicanos Moderados. But that's what we thought George Bush was going to be, a moderate Republican. That's what he told us he was 4 years ago. Now think back. If every election holds itself to be the most important in history, how do we make the case? Can we make the case that this one really is? That 2004 really is a cut above at least Harrison versus Cleveland. Let's go back almost 4 years to the last election, Bush versus Gore. December 9th, 2000, the day that the Supreme Court decided to make George W. Bush president. Yes, it was certainly a depressing day for the 51 million people who voted for Al Gore, 500,000 more than voted for George Bush. But look at it this way. We didn't yet know what kind of a president Bush was going to be. He'd run as a compassionate conservative. He'd run as a uniter. Remember the stories he told about the Texas legislature and how he got along with the people down there? That's the way he ran, because he knew he needed to run to the center, because that's where the votes are. He said he'd do the same thing in Washington, remember? But even then, how distinctly we remember it was in that bleak December, a Democrat, an independent, could still believe that Bush, who'd lost the popular vote and had no mandate, would be what he said he was, a uniter, seeking support from those who'd not voted for him in order to bring the country together. So you might not be too depressed. A centrist Democrat, a moderate Republican, a close election. Bush's 2000 platform had not been radical. Remember? Sure, he said he wanted a big tax cut, but at the time there was so much money floating around, even Greenspan said so, that we would have enough money both for a tax cut and for paying down the national debt and for Social Security. Remember the lockbox? Remember the lockbox? Anybody ever seen the lockbox? No. But poor Alan Greenspan, like most of us, could not foresee the greatest degradation in the national finances in history. The largest switch in 2 years from surplus to deficit. Nothing in Bush's 2000 platform hinted at the policies he would follow as president. There was nothing in the platform about Iraq. There was nothing in the first State of the Union message about Iraq. In his campaign, Bush had been cautious on foreign policy. His foreign policy sounded like traditional Republican realism, not that different from Eisenhower or Reagan or from his father. He'd been critical of Clinton's actions in Somalia, in Kosovo, in Haiti. His soon-to-be national security advisor had mocked those interventions by saying that U.S. troops shouldn't be used to escort little children to school. In the second debate, Bush said, quote, "I don't think our troops ought to be used in nation building." Well, tell that to the Marines. Let me read Morgenthau's first principle of foreign policy realism. I gave you the first part of it, now I want to read the whole thing. It's that important, I believe. Quote, "The United States has one primary national interest in its relations with other nations, the security of its territory and institutions. The United States has a number of secondary interests in the world, such as peace and security everywhere, the protection and promotion of democratic governments, the containment of communist governments and movements," he was writing this in 1969, "the relief of poverty and disease. The pursuit of these secondary interests is subject to two limitations. They are not to be pursued at the expense of the primary interest of national security, and they can be pursued only within the rather narrow limits of available wisdom and power." Unquote. Realism in foreign policy means defending national interests through collective security. That's what it's traditionally meant. And if you have to go to war, it's traditionally meant you do it, if possible, and it almost always is, with allies. If your cause is good, you're going to have friends with you, as they always have been in our past wars, including the Revolution. We mock the French today, but we sure needed them back in the beginning. There was only one time that we can really think of an important war where we tried to go it alone, and that's the only war we lost. Realism in foreign policy means doing all you can to avoid war because you never know how it's going to go. The fog of war, said Clausewitz. You just never know. Realism means you seek to achieve strategic goals, always seek to achieve strategic goals short of war, through diplomacy, persuasion, negotiation, what's sometimes called soft power. Bush left some things out of his 2000 campaign. He fooled us in some ways, didn't he? He's not been a uniter, he's not been bipartisan, and he most certainly has not been a foreign policy realist. Bush's war cannot be justified by the September 11 attacks, for the two things had nothing to do with each other. We know that now from several reliable sources, above all, the September 11 Commission, which consulted with all sources. September 11 was used as a false justification for war, just as false as Iraq's so-called weapons of mass destruction, by some members of the Bush administration who'd been planning an Iraq war for years. National interest? Hardly, Morgenthau would say. It's a classic case of false assumptions and dubious principles. Worse than a crime, it's a mistake. Bush has turned out to be the most radical president in the history of the United States. And if any of you would like to challenge that when I'm through talking, please do. I'd like to know who you would put in the same class as a radical president as George W. Bush. If therefore we choose to state that this election is more important than most, it's not just self-aggrandizement, it's the truth. Let's examine some of the things George Bush has done. He's divided the nation more gravely than at any time since the Civil War. In this election, fewer Republicans are willing to support the Democrat, fewer Democrats are willing to support the Republican than ever before in measurable time. He has polarized us. He has used doctrines like preemptive war that belong to dictatorships, not to democracies. Under this doctrine, he has taken us into a war that objective and independent analysts, such as the International Institute for Strategic Studies, say has aided the growth of terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, enhanced their recruitment powers, increased the threat of terrorism against the West and Westerners. If you wonder why our European friends opposed Bush's war, and why one that didn't, Spain, saw its government fall, it's because the European states, whose backyard is the Middle East, and who have large numbers of Middle Easterners as part of their populations, are a real victim of this war. Not as much as the Iraqis, but nevertheless real victims. That's why they oppose this war. Domestically, Bush has used doctrines like the suspension of habeas corpus for Americans and the incarceration of foreigners without trial that are incompatible with our Constitution, and even the Supreme Court that made him president says they're incompatible with the Constitution. He's turned the nation's fiscal account from its largest surpluses in history to its largest deficits. The Congressional Budget Office now predicts the federal debt will increase to $11 trillion over the next decade if Bush's tax cuts are made permanent, which he wants to do. Now, looking around here at most of us, we won't have to worry about that $11 trillion. We'll be long gone. But guess we'll be paying it. Under his administration, the nation has lost some 3 million jobs, and the jobs that are being created now have an average wage 30% lower than the jobs lost. His tax cuts have benefited the wealthy, primarily widening the income gap in our country, which is already the largest among the OECD countries. The OECD countries, as you know, the 30 richest countries in the world, only Turkey and Mexico, which probably shouldn't even be in the OECD, rival us in terms of what the World Bank calls its Gini index, which is the rating of the richest 10% of the people versus the poorest 10%. Our nation stands with Mexico and Turkey as having the widest income gap in the OECD. And Bush cannot blame the degradation of national finances on his war with Iraq. The Economist magazine, which many of you read, I'm sure, is a conservative publication. Can't get more conservative than that. And they just love American wars. I mean, the Economist basically has made a career out of getting Americans to fight British wars. I mean, you read them consistently like I have, and you know those people as I have for a generation, and they've never faltered on that point. If you can get Americans to fight the wars or to build up their defense budget, that's good for Europe, because then they don't have to do it. But the Economist magazine points out Bush's, quote, self-proclaimed party of small government has turned itself into the party of unlimited spending. If you wonder why some conservatives are having trouble with Bush's war, why you read more and more about this split between conservatives and neoconservatives, is because conservatives used to care about things like balanced budgets. You know, that's what my family was. We were moderate Republicans. We hated the Democrats because they were crazy spenders. I mean, look at the topsy-turvy world we live in today. It's just the exact opposite. Bush has made us, every one of us, members of the most hated nation on earth. Now, Jenny told you I spent 15 years in Europe, and some of that 15 years was during the Vietnam War, so they weren't always easy. And we weren't always the most popular, but I can tell you, it was never as bad as it is now. Because even though the Europeans never agreed, not one of them, with the Vietnam War, they understood our point of view. Some of them understood that it just might be true that this was a communist conspiracy. It just might be true that the domino theory was going to work. It just might be true that after Vietnam, Indonesia would fall, and then Australia, and then who knows next. So they criticized us, but I think they understood us. the kind of venom that you now read about from them, the distrust of American leadership, the feeling that we've really lost our bearings, this is new. This is new because they cannot understand the kind of fundamental mistake made in this war. Doesn't have an easy explanation, as Vietnam did. A wrong explanation, Vietnam was a war of nationalism. We know that now. But at the time, there was a plausible thesis that it was something else. Iraq makes no sense. We see it getting worse and worse and worse. And another parallel between Iraq and Vietnam is, if you remember Vietnam, Johnson kept saying, and then Nixon kept saying, it's getting better. Stay the course. We're getting there. Victory is around the corner. I covered the Vietnam peace talks for 4 years. And if you want an explanation of why George McGovern lost so badly in 1972 to Richard Nixon, it's this. Henry Kissinger, in October of 1972, just before the election, announced that peace was at hand. Remember peace being at hand? And so people thought, peace is at hand, we'll vote for Nixon. Remember the Christmas bombing? That's the surprise we got. For the first time, B-52s were used over a city. I wouldn't be surprised if we get a surprise like that this time, too. There's only one way to make sure we don't. A recent poll of 35 foreign nations showed only 3 preferred Bush to carry in the election: the Philippines, Nigeria, and Poland. Now, there may be Bush supporters among us tonight. I've heard this said before. Who cares? You know, we're America. We're the only superpower. We're strong. We're tough. We can stand alone. We've done it before. Who needs friends? Who needs allies? The idea of acting alone in a dangerous and complex world is irresponsible. The idea of disdaining allies who can help you fight and help you pay for the fighting is self-defeating. Think back to World War II. What was the first big decision that Franklin Roosevelt made after Pearl Harbor? It was to concentrate first on Europe, not Asia, not on the nation that had attacked us, but the one that hadn't. Why did he do that? Because he knew that Hitler was the big threat, the really big threat, and our allies needed help to defeat Hitler. One nice thing about having allies, as Franklin Roosevelt knew, and it's a useful thing to know, is they help you do the dying. Now, we lost 300,000 combat deaths in World War II, 400,000 total deaths of Americans in World War II. The Russians lost 30 million. Now, some people say we shouldn't have marched with Stalin. We were allying ourselves with the devil. Well, the devil in that war was on our side, and we needed him, and he helped us defeat Hitler. Allies are useful that way. Franklin Roosevelt knew that. In Iraq, 90% of the casualties of the deaths, I think it's higher than 90, it's at least 90, are Americans. That's not counting the Iraqis, because we don't count the Iraqis. We didn't count the Vietnamese, and we don't count the Iraqis. Although the reliable number of dead Iraqi civilians is 15,000. The reliable estimate. There's another war besides Iraq where we could have used all the help we needed, and that was the war on terrorism. For Bush to have squandered NATO's offer to regard the September 11 attack on America as an attack on all NATO nations, first time in history, right, David, that ever Article 5 had been applied by the NATO alliance, Bush rejected it. We don't need NATO allies. And for a year, we lost their help in Afghanistan. They're there now, but we lost their help for a year because we didn't want them in there. They might have helped us find Osama bin Laden. Maybe they'd have been able to find him himself when we concentrated on Iraq. To have rejected NATO's help by insulting our oldest allies old Europe. What does Rumsfeld think Britain is? I mean, the ignorance is appalling, but that's another lecture. That was yesterday's lecture. I think history will judge George W. Bush as among our worst presidents. And the danger of re-electing him, I think, is not just the danger it poses to America's interests in the world, it's a domestic danger as well, a threat to our democracy. Remember what happened when Richard Nixon was re-elected? Even though the nation knew by then that the Vietnam policy was a failure, Nixon escalated the war. That was the first thing he did with that dreadful Christmas bombing. But he also escalated the war at home. Remember how Watergate started? The Pentagon Papers, the break-in at Daniel Ellsberg's doctors, that created the plumbers, and then the plumbers moved on to other business, didn't they? To re-elect a president who makes false assumptions and adopts dubious principles concerning our national security is asking for big trouble. Has John Kerry been a disappointment? He has been a big disappointment to me, at least. His refusal for months to make the Iraq quagmire central to his campaign, when everybody in the Democratic Party knows it should have been central, was wrong. Now, Howard Dean may have been the wrong messenger, but he had the right message. Voters know Iraq is the central issue in this election. Now, belatedly, Kerry seems to have caught on. Trouble is now his remarks can actually be used against him as catching on too late, flip-flopping. He still doesn't seem to recognize that the central reason we cannot succeed in Iraq is because we are there. It's as simple as that. What we have done to the nation of Iraq, the uncontrollable forces that Bush has released in that poor country, is an abomination. In this place, in these halls, I have to remind you that America is violating every principle of just war theory. You know what just war theory is. St. Thomas Aquinas, St. Jerome, they were the first to say that not all wars are bad. I mean, if the Huns attack you, it's not wrong to defend yourself. So they came up with ideas to try and rationalize war, ideas that have lived for a millennium. Among the tenets of just war theory, we find proportionality. Where is the proportionality of a superpower against a third world country? Another tenet is last resort. We know that war was used by Bush far before the last resort. The weapons inspectors were still there. Legitimate authority. The Secretary of the General of the United Nations this week called the war illegal. Legitimate authority under the UN Charter, which we signed and is the law of our country, a legitimate war, legitimate authority means either it's either a defensive war when you're attacked and you have legitimate right to defense, or the Security Council of the United Nations passes a resolution making the war legal. That's legitimate authority under our own law. And when someone like Kofi Annan calls it illegal, it's because we didn't have that authority. And the war, under just war theory, is illegal. And under our own law, under the Charter of the United Nations, it's illegal. And the final tenet of just war theory that's been violated is you always make a distinction between combatants and non-combatants, between civilians and soldiers. Well, as I say, 15,000 is the estimate of civilians killed, and they all seem to be soldiers now. I mean, they don't wear uniforms. I mean, that's what's so horrible about this. We've just militarized a whole nation. They've coalesced around hatred for us. And although John Kerry came out with, he moved the debate, I think, somewhat this week by pointing out, by at least putting out a vague timetable for getting out, he still has to say the obvious. We won't have a solution in Iraq until we're gone. I think the best case you can make for voting for John Kerry and why this election is important is because Iraq is not John Kerry's war. It's as simple as that. Just like Dwight Eisenhower could end the Korean War because it wasn't his war, John Kerry is in a better position, is in the only position to end the Iraq War because you know George Bush won't do it. They're building bases there for our forces, permanent bases. There's no intention by the neoconservatives to get Americans out of Iraq. I think John Kerry is far closer to American traditions, history, and values, both at home and abroad, than Bush, and that would also help the situation in Iraq. He's been cautious on Iraq, but after Bush, we can forgive him a little caution, I think, as long as it doesn't cost him the election. In finishing, out of recognition again for where we are, for this institution and what it stands for, let me finish with a quotation from Stephen Runciman, the great historian of the Crusades. That's appropriate, isn't it? I talk about the Crusades here. And when I read this, I cannot help thinking of Bush's advisors, those poor, misguided neoconservatives who sold him on this futile war, who told him it would be his deliverance into the presidential pantheon, who saw it as the triumph of their strange neo-imperialist principles, as the conquest of American values over the obscurantist Middle East infidels. That's what they saw this war as. So let me give Stephen Runciman's answer to them. Faith without wisdom, he said, faith without wisdom is a dangerous thing, and the Crusades were a tragic and destructive episode. There was so much courage and so little honor, so much devotion and so little understanding. Thank you.
Hi, I wonder if you could comment on the Dan Rather CBS flap about Bush's military record in the context of whether they truly made a mistake or they've been muzzled.
Well, hand it to CBS. They admitted a mistake, and I just wish our president would admit a mistake. They were, I hate for you to think I'm a fan of Talleyrand, but another one of his bon mots was trop de zèle, too much zeal. That's what Dan Rather was guilty of. I mean, they knew that the Bush National Guard story was fishy. There were some holes. They wanted to fill the holes. These people appeared that said they could fill the holes. And CBS made a mistake. It accepted them without verifying it. I mean, we all do it. I do it. I've done it. They shouldn't have done it. They violated journalistic rules. They were caught, and they've been hurt. But they've now done the right thing. They've said they were wrong.
Hi, my name is Justin Hudnall. I had a question for you as a journalist who was working during the Vietnam War. You were part of a time when the media was partially responsible, at least, for ending that conflict, and now we see journalists afraid to seriously question government policy for fear of losing privileges, and in the worst case, CNN's quietly apologized failure to really investigate the claim of WMDs. Do you believe that the age of Walter Cronkite-style trust in journalism is over? And if not at least over, are you optimistic at all by the emergence of a more independent media? Thank you.
You mean independent like Fox News? I mean, it seems to me it's worse now than ever because all of those, I'm talking about television now, They're all owned by a multinational corporation. So that's naturally going to put influence on the journalist. What if the journalist is reporting on a terrible, what if an ABC journalist wants to report on a terrible scandal at Disneyland? I mean, you know, Disneyland owns ABC. So, I mean, it becomes, you get a real conflict of interest there. The networks are having trouble. The newspapers, I mean, at least in this city, you have an independent newspaper. A lot of cities have nothing but chains. And you may or may not like your newspaper in this city, but it is not a chain. And the decisions about this newspaper are made here in San Diego. It's rare that that happens. Almost all newspapers are owned by chains now. So it's a bad trend. It's a very bad trend.
Tomás Macias. The founders of this country gave us a tremendous plan for government in our Constitution. And the things that we learned as students in our youth was, to me, the greatest plan that they had, which is the balance of powers, the legislative, the executive, and the judicial branch. If Bush gets reappointed, or if he gets elected for the first time, it appears that there could be the possibility of, number one, they'll occupy the executive branch. Executive branch is responsible for administering, enforcing the laws. There's a very good possibility that Congress would be overwhelmingly Republican again. The legislative branch creates the laws. And there is no doubt that there's going to be at least 2, maybe 3 justices of the peace that are going to retire, which Bush can then replace. Hence, we would have a complete and total domination of the 3 balance of powers by one party. This is known as a totalitarian government. Without, at the risk of sounding far-fetched, sir, what is the possibility of a republic form of government turning into a totalitarian government, and what do you think would be the outcome? Thank you.
These are very, very dangerous trends. There's no question about it. There was a hue and cry this week about Russian democracy, and so I sat down and wrote a column, it hasn't run yet, on we ought to worry about our own democracy because of just what you mentioned. We have now, because of gerrymandering, we have Republicans basically in control, even though they're still a minority party in the country. They can control the House of Representatives through the gerrymandering. We have this electoral college aberration, which is just a disgrace. In the Constitution, the president was elected by electors. The senators were elected by state legislatures. Black Americans and women were not allowed to vote. Now we've corrected, through the 17th and 19th Amendment and the 14th and 13th and the Reconstruction Amendments, most of those problems. We elect senators directly. Blacks and women can vote. But the Electoral College, and that term, by the way, is not in the Constitution. There's no such thing as Electoral College. That stays with us. And we are much more likely to get the sort of situation we had 4 years ago, time and time again. Because as Americans concentrate in cities, you're going to see that the population, where the people are, is not where the electors are. The electors are still out there where the states, the small states, have the power. So unless we fix that, we're going to run into a situation exactly like you're describing, where gerrymandering constantly returns Republicans because it serves their interests to gerrymander since they're the minority party. The president will be elected because the electors represent the smaller states, and they can elect a president. And of course, if the president's a Republican, he'll appoint a Republican Supreme Court. So the people have to care about these things. I mean, that's what democracy is. You change it at the ballot box. I mean, if the people don't care about the Iraq War, we'll get George Bush again. If they don't care about eliminating the balance of power that you're describing, we'll get exactly what you described. So it's up to us.
I'm Judy Bishop, and along those lines, thank you. How do we get the rest of America to understand this president doesn't care about you and I. It's so obvious. What do we do to get people to understand this? Everyone I talk to, they're simply going to vote for Bush because it's a current circumstance. What do you believe we can do to get these folks to understand what's going on?
It's very depressing. You know, I'd really like to say something upbeat. It's, you know, in wars, there's always the initial knee-jerk patriotism thing, you know, the drums roll, and we're still in that stage, you know. We just don't have enough dead Americans yet for the people to say, maybe this war isn't working. And it's sad. But there's no way to combat it except by educating people and fighting for what you believe in. And if we could somehow, you know, there are little changes made. And I know we know that California, we don't matter. Well, there's certain states now where they don't even bother to campaign anymore, like New York or the South or California, because they're all, you know, they're sort of predictable. We have to change that. We have to change that so people care about California, or people go to the South because they think that Democrats can win down there. And you do see changes. I read the other day that in Colorado, on November 2nd, there's a ballot initiative called Proposition 36, under which the electoral vote will be divided proportionally by the candidates. Colorado has 9 electoral votes. So, you know, you'd get a 5-4 situation. If you had had that in Florida, which has 25 electoral votes, they would have split that 25, and Gore would have won the presidency by like 12 electoral votes. So you don't necessarily have to wait for the Congress to change the Constitution, because they'll never do it. But the states can do it state by state. So, you know, there are little glimmers of hope.
First, I'd like to thank you for your different point of view tonight. I do serve in the armed forces, so I wanted to learn about a little bit different. My question for you is, if the armed forces pulls out, like you're saying, if Kerry gets in, what do you do here as a big voice in San Diego? What are you going to do for the troops to let us know that you appreciate what we did over there?
Well, ma'am, in opposing any war, you always have to make the distinction between the military forces and the political forces. This isn't your war. You didn't go over to Iraq to attack Iraqis. You were sent to Iraq. So whenever we direct our attention at a bad war, whether it's Vietnam or Iraq, it's never with the troops in mind. They do what they're told. It's with the political forces in mind. And they can make bad wars just like they can make good wars, and you have to know the difference.
I agree with that. I just I'd like you to not forget the troops that are over there when you make your speeches.
It's very sad. We certainly don't forget you. And I'd say this, just in answer to that, another one of those little unrealistic things. If we wanted this war to end, the quickest way to end it would be to reinstitute the draft. That's a fact.
That's an awful idea.
My name is Susan Pollack. If you were John Kerry, what are the first 3 things you would do to undo the damage we did in Iraq the day after you moved into the White House?
You have to tell the people why it's wrong. This is what he has not done. He's floated all around trying to justify his vote here and trying to not be George McGovern and trying to not say he would pull out the troops the next day. But he's got to come out and state clearly why this war was a mistake, why it wasn't what Bush said it would be, and why we can't win it. And when you do that, I think at that point, you start to get sympathy from people who now oppose us. You might have the Iraqis who now hate us ready to admit that, well, if we can admit mistakes, maybe they can admit. You might see the situation now doesn't work. It's terrible. So any change that sort of makes Iraqis understand that we're not there to kill them forever, we're not there to impose our system on them, they will start taking power. We want to create Iraqi democracy. Well, let them do it. You can't impose democracy on them. This is the sort of thing that Kerry has to tell the people. We made a mistake. We misjudged. This wasn't a cakewalk. We haven't won. This isn't working. We need a way out. This is the kind of language I think he has to use.
May I? We have already had Mr. Goldsborough with us for an hour. No, please go back to the microphone. I believe, for your good sake, I'm going to suggest perhaps 3 more questions.
Wonderful.
Is that all right with you? So 3 of you, whatever line whatever order you're in, 3 of you to go. Thank you very much. Please go ahead.
Yeah, I was wondering what you think of Ralph Nader as becoming president, as opposed to John Kerry.
You know, if we learned what happened. We have the lesson of 2000. If we're stupid enough to vote for Ralph Nader again, then we deserve George Bush.
Don't you think he offers a real solution to the war, though, as opposed to John Kerry?
No, he's just. No, he's not. I mean, you'd like to think he would be, but the consequence. What's the consequence of voting for Ralph Nader? It's George Bush, so it's no solution.
Jim, given the fact that we all know, I think here, that the United States has an unbalanced policy in terms of Israel vis-a-vis the Palestinians and so on, and the concerns that some people have that criticizing the government, and you've experienced this yourself, I believe, criticizing the government for that unbalanced policy, wanting to see a more balanced one, subjects them to criticism as being anti-Semitic or being self-hating Jews. To what extent is that a factor, do you think, in getting public expressions of get a more balanced policy on this issue? Is that an important factor in your point of view?
Yeah, I think the politicians are very, very afraid of offending Jewish voters. Whenever I'm accused of being anti-Semitic, my answer is always, how come I'm anti-Semitic with Ariel Sharon? I was never anti-Semitic with Yitzhak Rabin or with Simon Peres. I mean, it has nothing to do with it. You can oppose a country's policies if they're bad, and you're for them if they're good. But Israel does occupy a special place, and the politicians know it. I mean, I'll give you an example of that. I can't think of how many times I've been asked, are you a friend of Israel? And my answer to that is, well, yes, I'm a friend of Israel, and I'm a friend of France, and Germany, and Japan. I'm a friend of lots of allied countries. But I never hear that question from any other country. It's always, are you a friend of Israel? So to me, the question itself is insulting. It shouldn't be posed. I'm an American. I'm a friend of Israel if Israel does things that I think are in the American interest. And if it doesn't, I'm not. So what's wrong with that? Does that make me anti-Semitic? Well, if it does, too bad. But then I'm anti-French when they do things I don't like, and I'm anti-Japanese or Oriental or whatever. The politicians look at it in terms of getting elected. There was a lady here yesterday, a Jewish lady, who came up to me afterward and said, her husband, she's from New York, she said her husband works in a firm. There were 10 Jews in that firm. They all voted for Al Gore last time. 8 of them this time are going to vote for George Bush because he's a friend of Israel. That would explain George Bush's policies, but is it the right policy for America? Is it the right policy for Israelis? Is it the right policy for American interests in the Middle East? I mean, it's much more complicated than that. Kerry's position is not all that different from Bush's on the Middle East. I mean, these guys have to get elected. Clinton's wasn't either. But once in office, he did some good things. So, let them say what they have to say to get elected. But when they're in there, let's judge them by their actions. And Bush's have not been in America's interest, they haven't been in Israel's interest, and they haven't been in the interest of peace in the Middle East.
James,
thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very, very much. Thank you.